Hey, Kevin, how are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Yeah, good, good. So this topic's about how to build an organic growth engine. Most of it will be kind of you, but I've got some comments as well around that. Yes, let's kind of get straight into it. So you run an SEO agency for nearly 15 years now.
Yep.
What has it been, 15 years? Wow, we've been together for what, must be 4 or 5?
Must be 4 or 5, yeah.
Yeah, so 15 years, yeah, a long time. So what do you recommend for people looking to build organic growth? Let's start with that.
Yeah, so I think everyone's at a different stage of the journey in terms of where they are in terms of marketing, where their customers are coming from. And I think for me, SEO is a great channel to reach new customers, but you have to be doing it in the right way and for the right reasons. So I think the starting point is, although I run an SEO agency, the starting point is almost being agnostic to the channel and just understanding where is it your customers come from first and foremost, how do you attract them? And I'm normally very clear when I speak to SEO prospects that if they haven't done SEO before, I'll try and have a conversation with them that is about the business, understand where their customers come from. And sometimes my recommendation might be that SEO isn't for you. I just don't think it's going to be a good return on investment to focus on SEO, because actually that's not where customers are finding you.
And
When
what
it
kind of,
is,
like, just out of interest, just kind of, how would you know? What are the kind of things in your head, the triggers where you go, from what you describe, SEO is not your best lever? What would make you think that?
I think it's a case of understanding where they get customers from right now. So if it's still early stage, it's difficult because you haven't tried everything, but you can take clues from the market. You can understand from a organic visibility perspective, are your competitors much further ahead of you? And if they are, that indicates that there's a stronger market. You could, and then 10x your growth, and there's potential to get a lot more traffic. And obviously with that becomes the leads and the new business that you're looking for.
Okay.
In some cases, it could be that people just don't search for things. Like if it's FMCG is probably a good example of, we've very rarely worked with clients kind of in that space. It's SEO is probably a channel that they should think about, but in terms of priorities, it's not top of the list. Whereas if it's e-commerce, travel, something more direct and measurable, their customers, certainly if the whole business is online, their customers are almost certainly using search to find them. So it's very dependent on the type of business.
Makes sense. And the type of sector, what you're saying as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So in terms of like kind of how do you find out what's the right channel to use? So this kind of like this bullseye idea. I think both of us have read Traction by, in fact, I've got the quote down. It was by Gabrielle Weinberg and Justin Mars.
That's right. Yeah.
What I'll do is.
Oh yeah, I can see it. There's two tractions as well. You have both of them.
There's two tractions, which is really confusing for our audience. Exactly. So this is the one we're talking about.
Yeah.
Can you just explain why you think it's I think it's a great read. So thanks for the recommendation. Why is it such an interesting kind of like read?
So I only read this a few years ago, and at that point, I would consider myself quite an advanced marketer, but I still took quite a lot away from that, in the sense of I think it's very good that you try to understand everything about where you can attract customers from. And from a business perspective, I think it's something like 21, maybe 23 sources of where customers typically come from. And it looks at each of those at a very top level view. And the whole concept is try a bit of everything, try to understand where it is that you can get more customers from, and figure out what actually has traction. So once you can see you're dipping your toe into certain different areas, once you can see that something is working, it might not be enough in itself to transform your business, but you can see that, okay, well, we are picking up some traction here. That's when you start to accelerate. So they have a concept which I really like, which is the bullseye model of you go down.
It's very good.
I think it is maybe the top 5, definitely the top 3 of this is the center of your attention in terms of that dartboard analogy of where you really want to focus on. And then you take those 3 channels, you maybe at first, let's say you spend £100 worth of money or budget behind each of them just to test the water. You might then say, okay, these are our top three. We're going to spend £1,000. Let's see what we can do for that. And then once you figure out what's going to work the best from there, that's where it could be, okay, well, we're really going to invest in this one key channel and then build it outwards. And I think when you look at how businesses grow, it's not because they do everything and they are everywhere. Certainly at a more kind of mature level of business, they are everywhere. They will be on TV, paid search, SEO, etc. But they don't start that way. They normally have one thing that they center their attention around and then focus. There's a very famous growth hacking story of how some of the brands grew. And one example is PayPal, who gave away, I think it's $10 to everyone that opened an account, and there was a commission for referring a friend and stuff like that. But a lot of people thought they were crazy because they're just giving their money away and they're going into bankruptcy. But when you think of it from a marketing cost per acquisition perspective,
absolutely,
actually quite smart.
Yeah. So cost per acquisition basically is $10 plus your cost of raising awareness, but then your long-term value. Because once you're on things like PayPal, you don't leave them.
No, you don't. No.
And they're taking a small percentage of each transaction.
Yeah.
And then when you've got millions, if not hundreds of millions of transactions going through your business, all of a sudden everyone's saying they were geniuses. I think this is quite important, Kevin. I think people often go, "Oh, you're crazy," and then it's like, yeah, you might think that, but if it pays off, you'll think we were geniuses.
Well, and also, I mean, there's definitely going to be lots of examples that no one will ever know about that just failed spectacularly and didn't work. But at the same time, if it does work, that's where you're not playing that brute force media, I need to have the biggest budget in order to win game.
Absolutely.
You're doing something completely different that, because it is unique, it stands out, and that cost per acquisition normally is quite a lot lower because you're playing a different game to everyone else.
And I've got this thing that we've talked about a lot about do a little, learn a lot, and then do the next one. And that's the same as, I mean, in principle, what the Traction book says is like, you've got to try things out. It's a phrase called active experimentation, which I did many years ago when I did my MBA, is that I'm an active experimenter. So I like to try things out. I'm like, oh, we'll give that a go. We'll see if it works.
Exactly.
And that didn't work, that kind of worked, but that really worked. Well, then let's put more fuel on the fire over here. Yeah,
exactly. And I feel like that's quite an entrepreneurial mindset as well in itself. Of entrepreneurs typically are very good at starting things, quite often not so great at following things through if it doesn't go to plan. And actually, in this case, I think that's a benefit, because you're willing to drop the stuff that doesn't work, but you will try it. But at the same time, if you can see that it's working, then that's enough to follow it through, at least in the early stages, so that you can hand it over to someone, but enough to understand what is it that works for you, and then you can double down.
Do you want to talk about also the kind of this idea of like lag and lead indicators as well?
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is really important, certainly in SEO, because in SEO you have lots of ranking factors, lots of theories of which I've talked about. Some may be true, some may not be. Most of them are different specifically for your own case of what you're doing. And you have to test and learn to figure out what really works. So I think having lead and lag indicators so that you understand what is it that's really working for you, what's the main result and goal that you're aiming towards. That's the big thing, that when you're judging success, are you making organic revenue? If you are, then that's great, but also you need to know what are the levers to pull that got you there.
So the lag indicator is the outcome. So revenue or profit or conversions or whatever the outcome is the lag indicator.
Yeah, exactly. And the lead indicators could be anything from publishing new content, fixing errors on your website, generating new links, digital PR coverage. That's the type of thing that these are the levers to pull to get there. But you don't measure success by, we now have 100 page errors as opposed to 1,000. That's housekeeping, and it's how you do it, but it's not why you do it.
I think that, again, this kind of lag and lead indicator we've talked about a lot. I'm a big fan of this. I'm an engineer by training. So that to me is, it's intuitive, is that, well, you look at the output and then you work out, well, which levers do I pull on the input that are going to have the biggest impact on the output?
Exactly.
And you're never certain about which one,
Yeah.
but to your point, if you've got 100 different SEO factors that you can play with, then you're not going to play with them all at once. You're going to optimize and say, well, which one do I think is going to have the biggest impact on that outcome? I'm going to track that lead indicator.
Exactly. And I think actually some people do too much at once, and that can be damaging.
Absolutely.
I had a client ages ago, and there was an e-consultancy article. This is going back, it could be even 10 years. They wrote an article that said, these are like the 20 things you should do to improve your conversion rate. And so the client got back to me. It's like, I changed these 20 things and our conversion rate went down. Why? and I was just like, but you changed them all at once, so I've got no idea why. Go back and change one.
Exactly.
And then do a controlled experiment and change and it's kind of like, I expect you did some things. You might have done 10 things that worked, 10 things that didn't work. And the net overall effect was a downward trend. But
just talk about, I mean, a lot of people in the audience will be very experienced and some maybe kind of earlier on in their careers. Just talk about that optimization. Why are controlled experiments so important? Why don't you pull all 20 levers at once?
I think certainly I can speak with experience on the SEO side. I think this applies to a lot of channels as well. But I think because everything is so fast evolving, no one has the 100% perfect answer of you should do X and it will equal Y. So for that reason, what you did yesterday might not work today. What you're doing today might not work tomorrow. You have to always kind of continually test, learn, and evolve.
Yeah.
And I think having a controlled experiment to make that work, certainly when you're thinking about getting buy-in from a client, I think that's much more important.
Yeah.
So a lot of companies, in terms of their organizational structure, are now product-led as opposed to marketing silo-led. So like, let's take financial services as an easy example of, you could have a team that is structured into mortgages, insurances, credit cards, etc. And if you can prove that something works within one space, so let's say an SEO change, you can improve your page speed, you might want to test it on something that is lower value. So let's say you take travel insurance as opposed to car insurance, and let's prove that that works on one page. If it works, you've then got a case that says, okay, well, we can now do this on higher value pages. If it works there, let's roll it out across the site. And the level of investment to test is normally significantly lower, which allows you to move quicker.
Yeah.
And the amount of buy-in that you can get off the back of the results means that you can then move faster if you really want to accelerate, but you're doing it in that test and learn environment, which again is kind of similar to that traction model. It's prove something works and then accelerate, put your foot down once you know it's really going to work. But don't do that with, like, I always think SEO is a good example of, it's a long-term investment, but it's not this blind leap of faith. There's a middle ground, which is, let's test that something works, let's prove it works, let's start small but aim big, and then you can grow into something that is, you have the evidence to prove that if you're going to roll out these changes, it's going to get there. So it gets more buy-in, and it helps to make people make more informed decisions as well, because ultimately the conversion optimization example is a good thing. There's so many tests that people will run, and I've definitely done this myself, where you have a theory, you're pretty sure you've nailed it in theory, and then you test it and it doesn't work. And maybe this is a podcast episode in itself, but there's a book I'm actually listening to the audio book for from Rory Sutherland on behavioral economics, and he talks about nonsense versus nonsense.
Yes.
And there's various examples he gives in the book. One is that Christians will earn more money, they have more successful jobs, they have larger houses, etc. And he says the logical explanation of that is, you might think it's nonsense, but it's not. It's nonsense because it's nonsensical. What you're saying is that from this experiment, the results logically don't really make sense as to why that would happen.
Yeah.
But those are the answers. So you can't deny the data and the answers that are coming back. And I think marketing is very much similar, that you need to test your theories, because in theory, anything can work. In practice, some things do, some things don't.
So I think this is a great example, again, kind of two parallel world examples in consulting. Consulting is often based upon a hypothesis-driven approach, because you're trying to solve a complex problem. That's why you've got a third-party consultant. So the nature of it being a complex problem means that there isn't an immediate obvious answer that just needs extra resource applied to it. So
Right.
you build a hypothesis. I believe that in order to get this outcome, if we do these things, it will generate that outcome.
Yeah.
Danger with the hypothesis-driven approach, unless you're a very well-trained consultant and you're very impartial, is you will seek evidence to support your hypothesis, which is exactly what you're saying. Is if you pose a hypothesis and then you've got a data set to look at, you can pick the data points that suit your theory and prove the answer.
Yeah.
And it's called confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be really dangerous, because you can prove anything with a large data set that you want, because you pick a subset of the data that fits your story.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's the danger in this hypothesis-driven approach. So you've got to take, I think you're going to be very skilled to work out amongst all these variables what actually is going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the other thing is you have to build that case at the start. You have to say, this is what success looks like before you run the test. Because anyone can run a test. I've seen it before with case studies, are a good example of, we know internally that this didn't go to plan. However, it did achieve something else that we didn't plan to do. So now it's a success. And really, that's not a success. That's not what you plan to do. There might be something else that you learned from that you should take as a benefit, but you should have a clear, is this test a success, yes or no metric from the start.
At the beginning.
And then you need to, which I think is one of those that it sounds obvious, but I don't think that happens enough.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Do you want to cover the kind of what's the best marketing channel for growth aspect in more detail? Yeah, can you just go through that?
Yeah, exactly. And this will completely, every SEO gives this answer to every question, which is it depends. And it's a really frustrating answer, but it's also quite often the right answer as long as you caveat it. So the approach I would take is, how do you look at what's working for you right now? What channel is getting the best return? And in terms of not just traffic, but customer acquisition is the most important thing, in my opinion. And if you can see based on those channels what's working for you, and again, there's analytics, attribution, etc., that needs to be considered behind this, you can then make informed decisions about how you move forward. And I think we're in a world where everyone talks about big data and making data-driven decisions. Quite often what I see is people's data isn't good enough to make those decisions in the first place. And I think that there's still too many kind of gut reactions, biases behind how people are choosing to spend their marketing money. And it really should be very data-led behind what's working for you and how do we amplify that more and more. And I think the other thing to touch upon is there's a stage where at first you definitely, I would say, need to pick one channel and just go for it rather than trying to do a bit of everything.
How do you work out which channel, Kevin? So how do you kind of like, is it based upon just years of, 15 years of SEO experience? Is it based upon the data that you find? How do you work out? Because people are probably thinking that sounds great, but how do I know what is the best channel to pick?
Yeah, it's got to be based on the data. So where is it the customers are coming from? I think using an agency as an example for ourselves, we do some SEO for our website, but it's definitely not a key driver of our new customer acquisition. And we have to find what works for us, where the customers come from. Typically, it's word of mouth referrals. then how do we start to amplify that? And it could be through content marketing and getting messages out through social media, etc. Podcasts, that type of thing. That's probably more successful for us than our own SEO.
Yeah, I mean the breakfast that that you've run, they've been amazing. Building that group that you've now got on Slack, that's remarkable.
Yeah, and I think that type of thing for us is what's worked for us. So we've then doubled down on what we think is most effective.
Yeah.
If you're an e-commerce platform and you find that people are searching for your products every single day and they're converting very highly, then again, that's something that you want to double down on.
Yeah, exactly.
It's finding how that works. And I think there's an element of how do you make paid search and organic play together at a certain point as well. So there's an argument that I would suggest maybe you want to start with paid search first. I strongly agree in a certain respect that that's a good way to go, because certainly from the data perspective, you can build a case of this is where the search demand is, this is how people are not just searching in volumes, but how they're interacting and engaging with your sites, how they're converting into customers.
Just talk about that a bit more. So as a strategy, because a lot of people go, I'm not going to pay for adverts until I know where the market is, and then I can use adverts to pour fuel on the fire to accelerate the growth. Mm-hmm. You're kind of saying actually, adverts are quite a good way, a small amount of spend on adverts, if I'm right. You're saying spend a little bit on Facebook adverts, LinkedIn adverts, whatever it might be, and find out where your market is, and then that gives you some data. Is that what you're kind of implying?
Yeah, so you could run a controlled experiment around, this is where we think our market is, this is, how do they engage with our website? So if we were to generate, let's say, 1,000 extra visits through paid search, that's a very interesting test just to see, have we got the right proposition? Is it converting? Are we targeting the right keywords? Because from SEO, let's say you've got a big keyword that you're trying to rank for, and it might take 12 months worth of activity, and that's quite an investment in terms of time or money.
Yeah.
You don't want to get there in 12 months time and then figure out that's the wrong keyword.
Exactly.
So actually, if you can test that first, I think that can work very well. So for us, I would say most of our clients that we work with, if not all of them, will have quite significantly invested in some cases in paid search. And then it's a case of how do we understand what works from a paid perspective and make that work from an organic perspective as well. There is potentially a trap of you don't want to get hooked on paid search and just end up spending all of your money into something that is essentially a tap that could be turned off. There's someone that was one of my very first hires. It's a brilliant maths student, so A-star student from Oxford Uni, Richard Fergie, I should give him credit, but I remember him explaining to me on one of our whiteboards about the bell curve of paid search spend. And what he was looking at was everyone thinks that paid search spend is linear. The more you spend, the more you make. And you don't, because if you go from £1 a click to £3 a click, that profit margin changes significantly. So
Correct.
Really, the point of which you want to stop spending is before that curve significantly dips. And that's the real trick, is you don't just spend and spend as long as you're making money or happy. You need to optimize for profit.
Correct.
And at the point that you're making most profit, then I would argue, actually, maybe you want to maximize that channel to the point that you can get there, but you also want to diversify that as well and not spend more money at the sacrifice of profit. How do you supplement that with organic search? People are searching for the same keyword. How do you then have more of a sustainable future by ranking organically as well as the paid search side?
So I think there's a couple of things there that I've definitely seen, which is, so one is a kind of a very simple principle, which is measuring your LTV to CAC. So lifetime value to customer acquisition cost. So lifetime value should be the gross profit, the contribution of a customer, not the revenue, which is the one mistake people make.
Yep.
It should be the gross profit per customer compared to the cost of acquiring that customer.
Yeah.
And what you're looking for is that should be 3 to 1 or greater. So greater than 3 to 1 of gross profit to customer acquisition cost. So if your average customer acquisition cost is $50 and your average gross profit over the life of a customer is $150, then you're probably heading into a territory of that's kind of working. But if it's 1 to 1, don't pour more fuel on the fire. It's not working.
Yeah.
The second thing is, which I was reading last night in a book that you recommended about that, how to generate traffic. Got the type of book was called now. But he said something quite interesting, which was the problem is if you look at the platforms about how they price adverts, at the early years of a platform, they give away advertising because they want to generate a market.
Yeah.
And then as you start to get a maturity in that platform, the price of adverts shoots up.
Yeah.
If you base your model, let's say it's TikTok, let's say, you know, whatever the price per advert is, 20 cents. Yeah, if they raise that to like $1, $2, $3, but you've based your business model on 20 cents or whatever the price is, you're out of business. So people that rely upon paid advertising to generate customers, to generate profit, you're relying upon the price mechanism for adverts to stay the same.
Yeah.
Well, if the pricing mechanism changed, you're out of business overnight.
Right. Yep.
So that blend of paid versus organic, yeah, whenever I've spoken to you about this, is that is really important. Because if you fail to have an organic growth strategy, as soon as someone changes the paid pricing mechanism, you could be out of business overnight.
Absolutely. And I think the best way I would say to look at SEO is almost like compound interest of like, how do you, every time you publish a new piece of content, how do you add to your overall traffic, the customers that you're acquiring? And that last post, like there's blog posts I've written that could be over 10 years old and they're still generating traffic. And that's the sort of thing, that's where you want to be, because when you look at the level of investment that's gone into that, let's say it's a day or 2 days worth of work, in the early stages, let's say it was worth it, but on that 1-to-1 ratio, over 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, it's definitely going to pay back dividends. So it's thinking about actually what it is that you're trying to achieve, but also how do you have that sustainable side of you're building upon what you have as well as the overall base. And I think organic search can be great to look at what customers are searching for and how you can attract them at not just the later stage, but also in the early awareness stage. So that's where blogging can come in and be very successful. Digital PR can obviously help from a link, SEO, PR awareness perspective, but also it can help to get traffic that can then, it's traffic on an external source, but then it's traffic that is aware of your brand as well. So I think there's a lot that you can be doing that builds up that overall picture, and it just helps you to continue growing.
So a great example of this is something that you did with me, 3-4 years ago now, under garden basements.
Yep.
So remember I wrote that guide, it was a PDF. You said, no, it needs to also be a blog. So we wrote it as a blog. Then you helped us optimize it. The search volumes for under garden basements is about 100 searches per month organically.
Right.
Searches per month. We managed to get that, I think Ubase managed to get that to rank on page 1.
Yep.
It still ranks there. I today, 4 years later, still get about 2 inquiries a week about under garden basements and downloads.
Yeah.
Because it works. Because Google go, oh, it's a high quality piece of content. It's about 3,000 or 4,000 words, that guide. And
that's where quite often people go wrong, because they say, we need content, let's just throw something up. What's the cheapest we can get per word, etc., etc. And actually it's not about that. It's about how do you create the best piece of content for your users first and foremost, because if you get traffic and they just look at the page and then bounce straight back again and never return, then that's of no use whatsoever. So firstly, how do you create a resource that's useful for them? And in doing so, if it's something that's more in depth and keyword rich, sure, then there's a good chance that's going to get rewarded by search engines. And like you say, sometimes you can get distracted by we're trying to prove SEO works, so let's get more traffic. Whereas in that case, we really weren't trying to get more traffic. We're trying to get
Yeah,
more customers. So it's about how laser focused and targeted can you go.
exactly.
And if you get 100 visits per month, but you can capture 10% of those as leads, then you've probably done extremely well. So
Right.
that's the approach. In fact, I just realized you have a search award behind your head for
That's
that work. So it proves it proves it works.
That's what we want it for. That's
Yeah,
exactly
exactly.
it. That was the search award. Correct. Very good. So let's go on to, do you want to talk about taking SEO to the next level? Because we've got about kind of 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So the way I viewed SEO, and I guess given the context of I started doing SEO in 2003, when it was a very immature industry. Everyone was making it up as they went along.
Yeah.
I think there's still an argument that SEO, to a certain extent, has a little bit of growing up to do even today, but it's definitely grown up a lot more versus where it was kind of 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And back then, the reason that we did SEO was to acquire more customers for our clients via organic search. And the key growth drivers to achieve that would be, number one, having a technical, solid SEO platform. Number two, having on-site content that matched what people were searching for. And number three, having a link reputation that gives that brand an authority to deserve to rank. So Google's algorithm won because it was based on PageRank, which was to do with links going into pages. So those three factors have always been the three key pillars of SEO. I don't think that's
same. That's still the same now.
At all. I think it's the
Really?
weighting behind each has changed, and I think the tactics have completely changed. So what we were doing back then is something that you wouldn't even think about doing today.
Right.
But and likewise, a lot of the technologies, the software tools, etc., are so much more advanced now versus what we had. But that said, the fundamentals of why you're doing it and the framework of how you approach it is very much the same. So I think at a more kind of mid to enterprise level.
Okay. And just touch on the tools for a second. You mentioned tools, so people are probably thinking, well, which tools are the best tools? Just kind of your experience over 15 years, which ones have stood the test of time, and are there any new challenges?
I think the challenge we have is now you have so many subsets of SEO that there's not a one-fits-all tool. And I think maybe in the past, there's a number of tools that try to be, this is your SEO dashboard and login, and you just need to be here, and it's all things to everyone. And I think generally those type of tools have kind of faded away a little bit, and now it's more about specific challenges. The one exception to that, and the one that I see being used much more frequently and expect over the next couple of years for that to grow a lot more, is Google Data Studio and the use of APIs to pull in the information that you need into that single dashboard view.
I'd agree with that, definitely.
But yeah, there's hundreds of tools on the market, from technical SEO through to strategy, forecasting, link analysis. It's finding the tools for that specific project that you're working on. And then the things that are kind of more always on, you need to have a subscription. There's normally multiple options that you can choose for each thing you're trying to achieve. And quite often it's more preference, but I think pulling it into a single destination and having the data is potentially a lot more, much more useful now from a marketing perspective, as opposed to the user interface and everything else that goes around it.
Okay. And what's your views on kind of like, next stage of content? So what would you recommend people doing around, if content's a core part of improving organic growth, then what would you recommend?
So I think content absolutely has to be central to organic growth. So I guess going back to those three pillars, you need to have a fundamental SEO platform. So having a strong CMS that is well optimized for search should be much easier today than it has been in the past. But that said, there's still a lot of issues in how you can make that as search engine friendly as possible.
Okay.
Let's assume you have a solid technical SEO platform, which some do, but it's very rare. There's normally improvements that can be made. Content is definitely the thing that you want to be focusing around how do you target that customer journey in the right way at each stage. And I always like to think of things as awareness, consideration, conversion phases, which is obviously widely used. But working backwards from a conversion perspective, you want to rank for your branded terms, your products, as successfully as possible. Ideally, number one, if it's your brand and your product, you need to be there. But again, that's sometimes easier said than done.
Just for non-SEO people like me, so when you say branded search, it's like you type in literally Resignal into the browser. You should be the number one that comes up for Resignal.
Correct. Yeah, and I guess where I say that's easier said than done is I've had brands in the past, so that I've worked with that have a range of products. Miele is a good example, and they will rank number one for a lot of their, let's say, vacuum cleaners, but maybe some of their ovens, they're getting outranked by John Lewis. So in that case, it's their product. How do we make sure that it's going to be, from a conversion perspective, that's the highest quality traffic you're ever going to get? They're searching for your brand and product.
Yes.
If you're not number one, I would focus on that before you even worry about anything else, because that's where the value is.
Yeah.
Normally that typically takes care of itself, but sometimes there's exceptions like that. From a consideration perspective, it's when people are searching for keywords that have intent to buy, but they're not specifically looking for a brand in mind. So they could be searching for running shoes, running trainers, etc., but not necessarily the Asics Gel Kayano.
Asics or Nike or Adidas, whatever it might be.
Exactly. And that's where you really need to make sure that when people are at that consideration phase, they're looking to buy, they have intent behind that query that is, I want to buy a product. So it's super targeted.
Yeah.
You want to be front and center, but you need to have the right content that answers that question, and obviously the right reputation and authority to deserve to rank for that as well.
Yeah.
And to touch on the third piece, so having awareness. So thinking about what people are searching for before they are ready to buy. What are those stages that gear them up to buying a product? There's one example that I wish I remember where I heard this from, and I might have told you this before, but when Samsung were doing research about why people were going to buy a TV, they found, and this is through user testing, is the first search people make on Google is, what's that buzzing noise from my TV? And the reason that, and they never would have thought that. They would have thought, okay, you're thinking about specs of TV, something like that. But no, actually the first thing they can trace it back to is the old TV that's going wrong that they're just about to throw out. And if you can think of awareness from your customers, you can then retrace their steps and say, okay, well, this is what they're looking for. These are user paths and journey that will take you towards becoming a customer. How do we maximize capturing that at every stage of the journey?
So this kind of reminds, that's a great example. If I go back to my days at KPMG, back to 1996, what we were always taught and what we kind of learned and we found out was thought leadership is key. If your brand needs to stand for, we are the best in the market at X, well, you need proof points. You need social proof from clients, you need quotes, case studies, but you also need thought leadership, you need content. Now, why do people write books? They write books to become known as thought leaders. A friend of mine, Richard Newton, he's a renowned leader now in program management and consultancies. He's written, I think, 5 books now. You need some mark of authority to go, they are actually a leader in their field. And we used to write, in the old days, white papers. We'd print them, stick them in envelopes and post them to clients. And that would be our marketing campaign. And it's no different now, only we're posting it online rather than posting it in the physical post.
That's
right. You need really good thought leadership.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's definitely a case of show it, don't say it. In a lot of cases, of like anyone can say we're the best at something.
Easy to say, hard to prove.
Whereas actually, if there's a case study that says we grew someone by X amount of % of revenue, etc., like that's the type of thing that is much more compelling. Certainly, if you can back it up with the approach and how you did things. And yeah, from a thought leadership perspective, I do quite like the concept of everything is documentation. So it's,
Yeah.
you're on this learning journey together. That's certainly how I started blogging. I was learning about SEO whilst traveling through Australia
Yeah.
and writing about stuff that I'd figured out. And it was almost like a journal of, I can reference this again if I forget it. And then I realized people had the same challenges and they were also on that same kind of learning curve, and it was useful to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of basis of almost like writing for one person, in this case it's more for myself than anyone else, if you can solve a problem for one person, then it becomes something that actually that's probably better than trying to please everyone and not really hitting them up.
So just to be kind of draw this together, I guess kind of two things. So one, I'd like to get your view on something, and then I'd just like to kind of like summarize kind of what you've said on the last kind of like 20 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, I think a lot of people think that if they just get SEO right, then they can become an overnight success in 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're saying is to build a credible position as a leader in whatever niche you're going to pick takes a while. It can take a year, 2 years, 3 years. Sure, there are certain influencers that can do it overnight, but do you still hold by that, which is this isn't going to be an overnight success? It's going to take consistent effort to write quality content over a long period.
It definitely is. And I think I always like to think of how can you show you're making a short-term impact, because you have to show there's progress, and that's why KPIs are really important. But what you're aiming towards is long-term success. The biggest results that I've seen over my career in terms of working with clients have been clients that we've worked with for 2 or 3 years or more. And it's looking at that kind of compound interest of how everything is paying off month on month on month. There's small progress. Let's say every quarter we're growing.
Yeah.
When you look back, that's significant growth. But sometimes people get carried away and excited by, here's an amazing big spike, which in the moment is great. But actually, when you look back over a year, 2 years, 3 years, did that really take you anywhere?
Yeah.
Maybe, but more often than not, I'm not sure it does.
I mean, as Warren Buffett says, the beauty of compound interest. I think there's a good example of look at the wealth generated by Berkshire Hathaway. It's colossal. And, but he's not looking. He said, I don't want spikes. I don't want overnight successes. I want really solid businesses that have brilliant business models, great moats, amazing fans, and they just keep growing.
A quote of his that I really like is, the reason why he's been successful is no one else wants to get rich slowly. And I think that's what he's done. Is patience. He's stuck to what he's doing. He knows what he's doing, and he's made it work when everyone else wants to get rich quick. And some will make that happen, but a lot really won't. And
I'm with you. I'm in the long-term game. I'm like, it's not going to work overnight, but I'll just keep doing the right things, and I know I will keep making more and more money.
Yeah, every day you progress and you move forward. And I think one thing, just to bring it back to traction, is how do you take that forward? I don't think traction is just for getting started. It's how do you turn that into something that, let's say there's 23 ways that you can acquire customers. How do you get to the point that you're using all 23? Would be you build outwards. So you take what's central to you. Let's say it is organic search. How do you then take what you've got from an SEO perspective and start adding more sources of customers? So how do you create more content that generates awareness from potential audiences? And how do you amplify that with digital PR that again gets you more coverage? How do you then start to build a brand holistically that is on TV, you're doing outdoor media, etc.? And all of those are signals that you're brand building, which are great signals that you're building something that from a Google perspective should be rewarded as being the brand that deserves to rank. But no one has the budget to start by doing everything at full scale from day one. You've just got to pick something and grow, and then build upon it step by step.
So I think a separate podcast we should look at is kind of brand versus performance marketing, and when is which more appropriate? What should the balance be? How do you get clients to stay with it for the long term brand building whilst maintaining the performance marketing piece? I think that's quite an interesting topic to cover, maybe on a separate session.
Absolutely.
So, 3 key messages. What the kind of things that are the takeaways from this for you?
I think for me, number 1 is probably experimentation. So test and learn. Be prepared to challenge your own thinking, and dip your toe in, definitely. Number 2, I think from an SEO perspective, trying to understand those levers to pull, and how do you look at the right investment that you're going to go for. So whether that's kind of technical SEO, content, PR, but again, going in there without any kind of predefined, this is what we're going to do. Let's understand what it is that your strengths and weaknesses are, and then build upon that.
Yeah, makes sense.
And I think the final one is actually what we've just ended on, which is play the long game. Don't just get excited by the short-term spikes and the campaigns that you're doing and all of the stuff that, again, that's part of the overall strategy. But for me, I've said for a long time, we don't sell content marketing campaigns, we sell SEO and content marketing strategy. It's about how do we take a brand from where they are right now and significantly grow their business performance. And the metrics behind that can be exciting to people at certain levels, but again, it's how do we significantly grow that business, and that happens in various different stages, but over the medium to long term is what you're really targeting success for. It's not just the short-term spikes.
Very good, brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. That was really good, really interesting. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you all next time.